Hello. So it's episode 8, right?
Yeah, that's the one going strong. Really enjoying so far because we've covered a number of topics through Design Company, which is privilege universality. So I'm looking forward to today's topic, namely the taboo subject of money and its various aspects, which we're going to discover today.
It's the big M subject, yeah? And so actively relevant right now where there is a whole bunch of people who've got too much of it and then a whole bunch of people who've got too little of it, right? So some sort of disbalance happening all around the world. What's your first thing that comes to mind when we mention the word money?
I would see it as energy. I mean, there's so many things. I think that's just a good way to dive straight into the purpose of money, right? So for me, if I look at what is the use of money, it's basically a tool for getting stuff that I want. And it's also a nice way of keeping score on the amount of value that I'm delivering in the world.
So I keep oscillating in my mind between thinking of money as energy, as currency, as cash flow, as a unit of accounting for value across, the ecosystem of business, as exchange, like a exchange mechanism for goods and services, and also as language. uh, and so all I think all those things are correct, and they are all useful definitions and useful ways of thinking about money. And when we think about purpose, people, systems, innovation, and products, then all those ways of thinking about money certainly can play a very important role in accounting for all of that, measuring it, keeping track of it, optimizing it, and so on. So that's really kind of where my mind's at with all of this. And certainly right now, there seems to be a lot of talk around how we can rebalance things and so on. So that's where my mind's at.
I mean, definitely. I mean, you have the good old classic economic definition of money. Something durable, so you can store money and save over time. It's portable, so it's easy to transport. It's divisible, so you have subunits, and it's pretty acceptable and uniform in the sense that it's very neutral. So once I've given you money for X, that transaction is considered closed. So I think what's interesting today is not to look so much at kind of the macro and the economic definition of money, because I think that's quite accepted. I think what's more interesting is to look at the psychological and social aspects of money, and economical, but not in the sense of financial, but really, money as a tool for social organization, and to see how that kind of permeates everywhere. Would you agree on that?
I think it's also valuable to think about money as a fuel. In some sense, money is also like a material that keeps the company fueled. It's
Hmm.
like the fuel for the engine. And certainly in a designed company model, it's the company that's generating that fuel, but it's also burning that fuel to keep going and rotate the wheel of designed company uh, faster and certainly in a sustainable way. And there is that, like if we use the analogy of fuel, there is the notion of using fuel wisely, right? Having to refill the tank and also saving it, wherever possible, and conserving it, and having an engine that is optimal to consume and conserve that fuel, and get you as long way as possible without having to refill the tank. So if sort of raising money from the bank or wherever is refilling the tank, we better have a company model that can make the best use of that tank and maybe recharge the batteries without having to tap into the fuel as much, as other companies have to do so. And again, right now we're having a situation where so many companies have so quickly ran out of money and ran out of that fuel that they're having to reach out to some sort of petrol station that can refill them. Otherwise, they can no longer continue the journey. And the story of tortoise and the hare keeps coming to my mind around it. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And what that really means is that if S hits the fan, the journey has to continue. We can't just stop. And even if we do stop, then we've got to be able to bear that standstill for a certain period of time without everything kind of collapsing down. And money is certainly like the key ingredient in all of that. So that's why it's in the design company model. But at the same time, it's in the model at the place where it is after products and all that kind of stuff.
And so what you said there is perfect. That's exactly the kind of stuff I want to be talking about today. So really the relationship we have to money, both as individuals and as companies, right? And so, I mean, if you go into this kind of people area of design company and, money, I would say what we're seeing now is kind of a shift in values because, for many years, even from the industrial era and even up until the 60s, 70s, society was built around, a small group of capitalists having all the cash, getting the industrial work done, and having people just kind of subsist, right? Now, if you look at the kind of second half of the 20th century there, we saw a golden era for maybe 30, 40 years, 50 years, where people had this middle class dream, right? Where money was abundant, where people could go to college for a very low amount, buy a house. And so we kind of had this unique time in history where there was a really good technological and social development, and then money was also rising and comfort was rising at the same time. And so what we've seen more recently is people are actually starting to obsess a bit less about money, at least it's coming out, and more about values, immaterial things like purpose, impact, this kind of thing. But there's a big trauma left over in society around money, because if you look at, for example, the educational system, it's basically been built to train workers and also as a promise that you can access the best paying jobs with it. So I think that if we're looking at the people side of money, at least one of the big things is how people value money in their life and how they go beyond just building a life that's dedicated to the acquisition of income. I mean, I love money for the right way. My goal is to be super wealthy, but I don't really give a damn about money. I just see it as a useful tool. And so when I see people, that say, oh, I struggle to get to this point in my life, I work so hard, I don't see why others would have it easy. I think there's a big trauma there around money that because it's kind of seen as scarce and people fight so much to get it, they become unable to see the forest of humans around them for the tree of struggle that's in front of them or behind them.
So I think one thing, as I was saying the previous statement that I was saying, something came to my mind, which is actually, as I kind of contemplate on this model, I get sort of new insights. And I think the way in which I designed this is a lot of kind of subconscious competence, or as it calls unconscious competence, that I've baked into this model. So I kind of like, as we talk about it, it comes out more and more. Because if you think about it, the business existed before money, right? That's why it's important to have products before money, because in the before money times, people exchanged products and services, right? And
Value.
Money only, yeah, exactly. And so, and bartered, right? So the barter system can always be a fallback when money collapses. That's also important. That's why products and services are before money, right? But whenever people put money before products and services, straight away you're getting this sort of, so to use the phrase, ass about face kind of approach. And so I think a lot of people now are starting to realize that as their suppliers and their customers are drying up on the fuel, they're falling back into a bit more of a barter system where they're saying, hey, how about we scratch your back on this and you scratch our back on this, so that just we can keep going and keep the design company model going and the wheel rolling without the money even being at play. And the other side of this is that with the Federal Reserve deciding to print unlimited amount of fiat currency going forward and removing all the kind of fractional reserve requirements, money has now literally become an unlimited supply of something that effectively becomes worthless And it's something that a lot of economists have been sort of flagging up more and more. And of course, then, we start talking about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and some of these kind of centralized blockchains that might come into play with central banks and so on, and where the system might go with all of that. And that seems to be kind of bubbling under with central bank in France, central bank in UK, and maybe even some sort of world central bank kind of talking about printing out cryptocurrencies in which money becomes a lot more accounted for resource that then will need to be redistributed in a way that's a lot more balanced, like the designed company model is trying to balance things out, and say that it's not just about growth or just about innovation or just about the product or just even about people. It's about all these 7 things and getting the right balance across all of that, because then you get all of them working much more in harmony.
So that's interesting that you mentioned systems. I mean, there's so many things to say there, but one or two that pop out with me is, first of all, you mentioned the Fed, the central banks. I think there's definitely something to be said in terms of the role of the government or experts ensuring the monetary policy to ensure that your pounds or euros can buy you an apple today and an apple tomorrow. So obviously, having these kind of movements and
I need a new Mac. I need a new Mac very soon.
Yeah. So, having this kind of expert system to regulate the distribution of money, the people that are allowed to do banks, that's good, right? But I think in terms of the systems of themselves of assignment of money, there is one thing for me that needs to evolve. There's a more political view, but I think the only solution is, if you look at today, right? Look at the way we measure success in our society, GDP. So if I go tomorrow and I start drilling for shale gas, I'm going to raise the GDP, but I'm destroying the planet, and that energy could have potentially been produced with alternative sources of energy that would have funded R&D, that would have funded technology. So the value there is really not being counted in the right way. So that's the first thing, is how do we measure the value that we're producing and really kind of add other factors than just money to monetary value? Even though money is good because it's subjective, how do we kind of modulate that? The second thing, talking about systematic, is, again, how measuring success. If you look at every single government today, they keep talking about unemployment rate. But my view of that is that that's actually an antiquated view, because you're now in an era of automation and technology. And so to pretend that everybody's going to have a job in the future, I think is nonsense, I think instead what we should be doing is measuring things like quality of life, job satisfaction, purpose, these kind of things, right? Really people's contribution, and also ensuring that all these survival jobs are kind of not needed. And that's why I'm a big proponent of universal basic income, because I think that today there's a lot of jobs that are irrelevant, and okay, some of these people might lose a bit of a standard of living, but collectively, if we just stop saying, hey, everybody needs to struggle, and we say, okay, let's let the driven people make all the money, but let's make sure the initial minimal standard is there, and let's give people the opportunity to figure out what their purpose is, what their skills are, what they want to do, rather than formatting them and shuffling them from very early age into vocation and career. Because the truth is, in a world like today, you're not going to have the same job for 40 years. You can learn things, you can evolve, you can pick up new practices. So that's why I think, in terms of a systematic approach, it needs to be a cultural shift in terms of understanding that, okay, money is useful for stuff, but it's not the sole indicator of human value. And so we need to guarantee these fundamental rights to basic life to every human, and then have a healthy ratio to money with regards to the rest.
So it's a very, very essentially it's a wicked problem, because what's happening right now is that each one of the 7 design company areas are being impacted, and potentially impacted quite heavily. So what's the purpose of our lives, with 7.5 billion people around the world trying to live, and maybe trying to live a life that's worth living? What's the purpose of that? How can we do that? What's a purposeful way and meaningful way to do that? Who are the people who are, having to sacrifice something, or, people who are having to sort of, change their lives and ways of going about things, how might the new system rebalance itself with regards to money, with regards to issuing, printing money, assigning money, taxing people, all that kind of stuff. These are hugely complicated things to think through in the best of times. Then innovation, what really matters, what really counts versus, are we doing this, what's considered like, sometimes I refer to it as turbo folk, but it's basically like innovation for the sake of like pretty stuff, pretty new things that don't really mean anything, that have no real purpose. Like, how many condominiums do we need around the world that are just kind of bought by rich people to never be used, to just kind of bought for their appreciation value? And then in terms of products, which products do we have? In the pandemic, we need more of these like protective masks, testing kits, this and that, versus Ferraris, yachts, cruise ships, and God knows what kind of polluting stuff. And then in terms of the money, how that works, who issues it, how is it tracked in terms of spending, taxed, how does it even work? Is it a digital thing? Is it a paper money, cash? What are the implications of that? What's the even accessibility of that? Because some of the older people or poor people don't even have devices on which you could load up some sort of crypto wallet and so on. So imagine for somebody who's never even used anything digital, now suddenly they're having to go to a crypto wallet, right? That says, and people say, hey, on this thing is what you can use to buy your bread, milk, and basic necessities. Like what is even like, what are we even talking about here? Imagine what this kind of like cognitive shift that people need to make. And then only we get to growth, as in, can we survive at all? And then if we can survive, can we thrive at all, right? And that's the stuff that's getting somehow rebalanced, but it seems to be being rebalanced in exactly the opposite way of what it should be.
Makes sense. So you mentioned a couple topics then. Really, if I had to look at the topic of innovation with regards to money, I think the biggest innovation will just come from more of a social reconfiguration of how we distribute wealth, right? Because if you look at innovation in the traditional sense, you could say it's the fintech stuff. So all of these, shared solutions for having a shared piggy bank to make payments, crowdfunding, that's all good. The disintermediation stuff, so blockchain, Kickstarter, etc. That's all interesting. But I think that's only the tip of the iceberg, because really what we're doing there is just kind of digitizing behaviors that already exist. I think what's really interesting in terms of innovation is more like going away from the technology and redistributing value. So for example, I think what you're going to see more and more of is companies with the goal of making their employees very rich. So for example, still need to work on my driving license, but I kind of had this, how do you say this revelation that, if I'm going to buy my Audi R8, which is like, it's 150k euros, this nice car, I don't want to be that dude that shows up to the office parking lot, that sees his employees, and he's like, well, if you work harder next year than you work this year, I can buy the new one.
yeah. And yeah.
It has to be that if I can buy that car, then all the other employees, at least the senior ones, because obviously I'm going to pay interns well, but you've got to earn your place at the top. But it should be that at least these top staff at level can also have that same level of purchasing power. Even if you're the founder, even if you're taking a lot more sacrifices, you're rewarded in other ways. But people moving away from this position where there's a big capitalist, so I'm not talking about voting shares, control all this, that can be done in a healthy way, but at least distribution of wealth, understanding that people today are better informed, and that it's really hard to look at talented people in the face and say, I'm making 100x more than you, but you get to be passionate at this job.
So there is something to be said here about a topic which perhaps we could dedicate a whole podcast episode to, which is around the idea of designing the company economy. Okay. And so that really sometimes, in startup world and the business world, we talk about like business models, but really, the business model is usually around pricing and how does the customer pay for the product? Is it a subscription? Is it that kind of stuff? And to what extent, maybe the cash flow checks out over 2, 3, 5 year period, stuff like that. And how much money does need to be raised in order to keep the company growing and so on. But really, that's very kind of surface way of thinking. The more comprehensive way of thinking would be to actually understand how does the money distribute across all the other 6 areas of the company, really, and how does how does it strengthen each area so that the company keeps being balanced at every increment of its own evolution. And that may involve some sort of internal share trading, for example, between employees, and all those kind of things, because shares are also a form of money, paper, and so on. And, in some sense, platforms like Ethereum and so on, where at least they still are talking about it, but it's not necessarily as loud in my ears as it was before when the DAO thing was on. But the discussions around distributed autonomous organization, really all the smart contracts are discussing around how to distribute the money in smart way through the organization, and really automate that process, so that, for example, when employees do certain things that hit the certain growth KPIs, they can actually automatically get rewarded for those tasks and so on. So the system of the company can be automatically managing the economy of the money and distribution around. So you're actually just recognizing people for their work. So there is no necessarily CEO of the company, or the CEO is the person who does the most valuable KPI related work. And, it could be the least qualified person with the most relevant input and output that they generate through the model. So it could be the intern that makes the most money because they're actually really delivering the value across the whole organization. And the CEO, who might have a MBA or executive MBA, might actually start having to be coached by the intern who's actually clocked on to the next level of actual innovative thinking. That's really what I'm thinking about. And so that we're no longer talking about business models as in how to milk more money from the customer, but more around business models around how to redistribute wealth in a way that is actually making the wheel turn, stay more sustainable and actually turn faster to serve the purpose of the company and maybe even other companies' purposes.
So I get what you're saying. I mean, I do understand how a newly arrived employee could actually bring something really good to an organization. I do think having one leader at the top that's there for
this is highly unlikely that an intern is going to just rock up and become better than CEO.
It is awesome, right? But I mean, for me, I'm more partisan of benevolent dictatorship. As long as the CEO is competent, I think it's healthy for a company to have ongoing leadership. But definitely to kind of stay in that same theme, I think what you'll see, and this ties nicely into products, is the definancialization of money, right? So right now, if you look at money inside a company, it's always, the CEO signs the check and the financial policy is in the financial department, and then the budgets are set. So I think the product of this kind of new approach to money will be a much more proactive, collaborative decision-making on the attribution and distribution of money. And I like what you said as well about the DAO, so distributed autonomous organizations. So connecting money to the business systems, to business outcomes, and having a much faster, action reward cycle between employee actions. I think that's a really good way. Because one other thing which I think is really despicable is, when you get into discretionary bonuses and things like this, it produces just a culture that's terrible, right? And people talk about bias, diversity. At the end of the day, the best way to overcome all of this is to have an algorithm, and not necessarily code, but clear rules for the distribution of money that are open to everyone, that are discussable by everyone, even if someone has the final word, but that are at least subject to discussion, and which apply to everyone in the same way. Because that's what's going to reduce bias and any issues ultimately.
So you could have a system internally inside the company. For example, let's say, the purpose of the company is whatever it is, and then you require a bunch of people to do tasks, right, to realize that purpose. They're going to do those tasks through a systemic process, and each task is assigned a certain level of value. It could be in that company's currency, internal currency, okay, which actually could get generated, right? Let's say through this economic system, the company's currency could get generated as people do the work, and as they create a product through innovative thinking, they create a product that's worth more and more in real terms being, let's say, the money in the external world, such as pound, dollars, Bitcoin, etc., gold. Okay, so then you are rewarding people who are doing the work in the internal company's currency, let's say maybe even shares, okay, because you can say, you can just notionally say there's going to be 20 million shares, okay, for 20 million tasks, or 20 million units of work that are needed to be executed for the company to, let's say, reach even to the MVP stage or something like that. And those people, as they work on it, they gain in those shares, and then when the company goes into more of an actual earning the dollars, they can actually start then cashing in those shares back for the dollars in the real world, something like that. That's what I talk about when I'm talking about like balancing the economy. And I think you've had a go at like writing a few sort of blockchain white papers. When you start doing that, you hit the money thing, and you start realizing, oh, this is going to be part of the code of the company, right, and how it works. And then it starts you really have to scratch your head thinking, how is money going to work here?
I mean, that's actually very interesting what you said there. I like that idea. It's something to dive into deeper, but I do see that this could work very well in terms of, because you can't just value. I mean, in essence, I think the negative attitude is to directly equate effort to money, right? It's not about effort vs money. It's about effort vs results, but effort is also important. So I think, yeah, if you could like have a quantization of useful effort, and then link that to when there is a result that's generated by a project which involves different people, the idea that you would have these shares that you could cash in, and that project in its whole, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't deliver value, everybody wasted time, right? But once I think delivers value, people who build the value that combined delivers that value get rewarded. I think that's good. And a second thing as well, which is really interesting, is that for budgetization, for financial planning of future initiatives, you'd be able to have like a really granular insight into what the costs behind an initiative were and how you could save money in the future. And so, talking about money, I'm not saying like cost saving in the sense of cost cutting everywhere, but at the end of the day, if we say that money is energy, human energy, then we want to avoid wasting as much human energy as possible, right? And so the less work the people have to do for the same outcome, the better it is. And actually, the keywords and vocabulary of dilution in companies. So when you get investors, you have to issue more shares. So in this notional system that you discuss, if we were more effective on the subsequent project, less effort shares would have to be distributed, which means that the existing people who put in effort get a higher share of the reward. That's just some thinking there.
So yeah, I mean, so the idea here of shareholders, right, is like, when it's even in the language, most of the time, people say like, I'm buying into this company. What you really ought to be buying into is the purpose and the people and how they're doing this systemically, what kind of innovations they're picking up and so on. So let's say if the original founders of that company, who perhaps worked for free, because freedom is guaranteed to all of us, however much we're locked down. They're working for free in their, quarantines, and they are, agreeing at the beginning, which is how companies are created anyway. In like Companies House, for example, in UK, you say, well, this company is going to have 1 million shares, okay, and each share is worth 0.0001 pound, okay, so overall it's like £1 net worth. But as you assign the tasks for people to do, and they earn the shares, which as the development happens, the shares gain more and more value in this imaginary, share chart, okay, the external investors that might be coming in and saying, "Hey, I want to give you some of the hard-earned, freshly printed Fed dollars." Okay, they will be buying shares, and then the internal stake shareholders in the company can just literally sell the shares in the internal marketplace of the company for those dollars, and effectively cash them in. But they ought to be incentivized to then continue working on the purpose of the company. Yeah.
Yes, so I think what you're talking with there is like, the classic thing in any venture deal: primary, where you're investing money into the company, and secondary, where existing shareholders are selling effectively their money, right? So, sorry, selling their shares. So I think there, if this is applicable, it's really just more of the same. But I think what's interesting then would really be going deeper, and this is kind of a future research topic, into this granular assignment of shares for effort and results, right? So instead
Yeah.
of having, okay, I'll give you X percent, saying this is the initiative out of the total budget of the company, this is, if the person is working on a specific part of the company of the whole thing, this is the share pool assigned to this, and you will receive shares in exchange. You need to, but there's something to be done there. I think it would make it would really give an incentive for people to do stuff. Because it's easy to give shares. It's much harder for people to contribute ongoing basis.
Yeah, and it's like effectively we're just living in a global economy where incentives are majorly disbalanced,
Mm.
and the person that has money but no purpose for it can literally just be sitting on that, hoarding it. And that's the case with big corporations and the biggest investors, which is kind of like they literally say, Warren Buffett's got whatever billions, that he's sitting on, and he just says, I don't know what to deploy it to. What he means is like this: that he doesn't really see any purposeful enough companies, that deserve that money, and it's so we're basically in some sort of stalemate economically, which has become a massive bubble, which is now being deflated and then reinflated by new money printing. Like, current thing is not working, everyone knows it, and what the new thing will be, who knows? But here is a suggestion, right, of what might work, and it's actually not that different to what works with. There are a few companies that actually do this in quite a transparent manner. So what's one of the social media companies that helps you sort of post up your Instagram photos and
There's
face
Hootsuite, Buffer.
Hootsuite. I think it's Hootsuite or Buffer. It's Buffer who actually has a report on their website. I think I shared this with you once before, where they kind of show exact breakdown on what they spend their money on, like staff, costs, offices, and then how much they take in terms of profit. So it's very transparent in terms of how they run that. So this is not a new thing here. It's just that it's very, very niche. It's like super hipster, and it probably ought to be very sort of mainstream. Yeah?
Makes sense. So, I mean, talking about mainstreaming best practices, then, we have the final topic of growth. I said before, the way we measure growth right now as a society, just purely in terms of money, is not the right, it's not sustainable, right? So if we're going to talk about growth, so far, like, as a society at least, growth has directly been equated to increase in money, increase in GDP, increase in financial success. And so I think there as well, it comes back to what we previously said about purposeful growth, about money being a tool to achieve that purpose and being able to measure whatever impact you're having, right? So in that sense, I think when we talk about growth, money is not the end. It really is just the tool to fuel the metrics of your growth that are driven by your purpose.
Yes, and again, the model itself lends itself to the measures that one can set up in terms of the KPIs. So typically, the way I would use this, when I'm working with clients, I would speak to them about each one of the areas, and I'd say, what's the purpose of your company, and then they would state some usually kind of badly phrased phrase, but it's better than nothing. And then I would ask them, what's one way in which you can measure the realization of your purpose per unit of time, whether it's hourly, daily, per minute, per month, and so on. And then regarding people, there's like customer satisfaction measures, there is people happiness internally. In terms of systems, there is a KPI around some sort of like performance per unit of either time or money and so on. In terms of innovation, it could be like the number of ideas that are generated per unit of time and so on. And then products in terms of quality and satisfaction with customers. In terms of money, how much money is being made. And in terms of growth, how much the company is growing in respect to either people, systems, innovation, products, or money, or purpose, right? And so the KPIs ought to run at least one per area to have the measures of growth overall in a balanced way, as opposed to just going like, we're making more money. And then when you realize that when the external situation changes, like it's changed now, suddenly everything stops and you're no longer making money, and suddenly you're having to ask money from outside, as opposed to having something to fall back in on, which is an internal working system that makes sense and that works irrespective of money.
Certainly, and I think that's a good way to end today's episode. It's really kind of, at the end of the day, money is great, right? Because it's an objective measure of your value and success in the marketplace. But really, what you should be doing is figuring out your purpose and then having people centered around that, taking care of them, right? And so what we've got to stop doing, we've got to move beyond, is money as the be all and end all. But not, we can't go hippie like, man, there's an expression in French, vivre d'amour et d'eau fraîche, which is living off of love and fresh water. You need a bit more than that to live a fulfilled life, right?
Yeah, love doesn't get the job done, as Dan Pena would say, but there has to be an element of love there, because hate also doesn't get the job done.
Exactly.
Balance is the key.
Balance is key. And I think that's a great way to end it on today's episode.
So, I definitely don't hate you, my brother. I very much love you, and love to every listener as well. And thank you very much for tuning in. We're hopefully going to get some very interesting speakers in next episode. So fingers crossed for that.
See you on the next one.
See you in the next one. Bye-bye.